We resume.
Good morning, you handsome devil.
We've got fresh coffee. We're ready to reconvene to study the law in more exquisite detail. Make you the host.
So, you're going to make me the host. Can I let me now share my screen? Let's talk about what the people. Is that Nixon? Who did that? Nixon.
Yeah.
Not somebody I want to imitate. Okay, what the people asked for was this. Gee, Kurt, we want to follow along. All right. So the way you follow along is to go to the naturallawinstitute.com and go to the lawful, right? So I'm gonna, I don't, if I can, how do I?
The-law-full.
Right.
Flash.
Right, and that will bring up this page.
When you're not sharing.
Hold on, I got to get there. You know, you're like. I want to tease you like you're like being impatient, like my ex-wife. I figure that's probably stepping over the line, though.
That's pushing it, man.
All right, so that will bring you. If I am correct, let's just make sure it doesn't require this. Okay, that will bring you to the front matter, right? This is where I sort of work things out, right? Nothing here is concrete. It's just it's the first draft. All right. And so what you want to go down to is you see the front matter, which is like the table of contents, the board, and that nonsense. The introduction to the program. You want to go down to the computation. Section 2.5. Whoops. And that address is up here, which is the lawful ? Section equals evolutionary dash computation. I'm going to put that in the links in the video, right? So you'll be able to find it. But if you really want to follow along, what we're doing is we're drafting most of this in one place, and then we'll migrate it. So you'll see all these diagrams in the beginning, right? And these are just placeholders for me as I'm working. And this part of topics here is just where I'm reminding myself what Brad and I have to talk about. And then we start working through all these sections. What you want to search for is whatever we're working on. So in the case of today, what we've been working, of course, what is law, right? We just go down to, what are we working on? We did legitimacy, we did rights and obligations, content. And then we did self-determination, and we did now we're down in interest. So if you want to work on what we're doing for today, you just hit Control F and type in test of sovereignty, and there you go. There's no shortcut because this is a working piece. Brad, your face, I'm watching your face for whether I'm doing okay or not.
Doing great.
Right.
I was just wondering if you could open up a couple more tabs so I can look at some more little black swans on top.
You're so mean to me. But people don't get this, but I've used, if you could see my desktop, my bar, you would see all the tools I have for writing. I literally have everything, right? I have everything you can write with it. Believe it or not, WordPress, well, that too. WordPress is the best tool for writing a book I've ever found. And the reason is because if I just build up, here's my outline, here's what I'm working on, here's the Constitution, here's some draft other things. Right? I just keep open everything I could possibly want to work on, and I just click on it.
How many
And
screens do you have there? 6 screens? Not how many tabs. I'm talking about like how many monitors do you have?
Oh, I only use 2.
Oh, okay, just checking.
I have you right in front of me, and I have the text above me. And so if I'm really working, what I do is I use the top one for reference and the bottom one for writing, or sometimes I'll flip it around, right? But
Okay.
it doesn't matter to me. I work best with 3 monitors, which is to keep one with mail and, you know, that's noisy shit. One in front of me I'm writing on, and one that I use for looking up and reference. And if you just have 3 monitors, then you're there. Unfortunately, I don't have the space for that kind of thing in my little condo. So,
Okay. That's housekeeping.
Mhm.
That was a housekeeping discussion. That's all.
Really, I mean, WordPress is awesome, right? Because if I want to go into something, I can go right into the HTML and edit it.
Right.
There's an almost endless number of ways I can print this out. I can convert it to a PDF or a Word document or anything, and you know, and I have control over formatting. And you know, I don't. The biggest problem I have with most word processors is that I have to use a lot of indents for the kind of work I do,
Right.
and that tends to be just better in HTML than anything else. I mean, it's just Word does a pretty good job, but the problem with Word is there ends up being all this. I mean, if you look at a Word document in code, it's just a phenomenal amount of shit back there. And if something gets out of hand, you can't fix it. Cleaning a Word document up without making it worse is, there used to be a tool back in the day for cleaning out stuff, but still it's a nightmare. So.
All right, you're going to warm up the audience so they know the context of our work today.
I live to serve you, sir.
Thank you.
All right. So again, we worked our way up from reciprocity, right? And because of what we're doing, I'm repeating some stuff because it's hard to remember.
Hey, for you guys who want to follow the URL in the above, shows you where you can find the document Kurt is working from.
Right. So I started out with, what do? We acquire, we cooperate to acquire, what's our first principles of cooperation? This is where I ask all the questions Brad doesn't like. Then I go into the law of reciprocity. I skipped over truth. Technically speaking, truthful speech is reciprocity in display, word, and deed includes truth in speech, right? Which is reciprocal. I skipped over that because I didn't want to go down in the weeds. I went from reciprocity to demonstrated interest. In other words, if we're going to test reciprocity, what is it that we want to be reciprocal in regards to? I enumerated those things as existential, obtained, and common interests. Right? And then we started talking about, well, how do how do we observe what's the evolution of demonstrated interests? What's the evolution of how we defend demonstrated interests? How do we atomize demonstrated interest? In other words, how does it move from tribe to clan to family to the individual? In other words, over time, demonstrated interest becomes decreasingly collective and increasingly individual, according to the increase in the complexity of the division of labor. So back in the day, you couldn't just sell your farm and take all the money and leave all your family without a home. You could only do that if the whole family was taken care of. Then we said, well, the ability to, we had to define what a right was, what kinds of rights there are. We had to come up with how to reserve conflicts. We talked a little bit about how we incrementally suppress different kinds of conflict. Then we said, okay, but here's the problem is that as we scale, there are multiple means of influence. There are multiple coercive institutions that develop trying to produce coercive influence. And therefore, there's always a competition for who's producing law between the state, the law or the court, which is the resolution of differences, and the cult, the religion. And the problem is that just like there's a problem of behavior here, there's a problem of neural economy. And all people, not only do we have people fighting for the control of who produces those laws, those rules, we have the problem is that people always seek to make it so that there's only one of them, because trying to keep track of managing those three kinds of laws is very difficult. So people, institutions, and civilizations try to combine them together. And therefore, all of these forces are competing to produce the rules that we call law, which creates ambiguity. So now we have to go and disambiguate what really is law and what isn't. And so we work through that. We have walked through the evolution of the kinds of laws that there are, and we disambiguate, the laws of nature, the laws of agreement, which is natural law, the laws of privilege, the original laws of excuses, and just the ordinary commands. And so then we talk about, I thought I did edit this. I edited this somewhere. I can switch to this page and have it edited. We'll continue. The scope of laws, which is, in the sense that we use the term, there's the law of science, the Constitution, the legislation, jurisprudence, there's lawyering, there's attorneying, there's paralegaling, there's licensing within different distributions. So, I mean, there's a lot of different rules that come out that we collectively push under laws. Well, that's great, but what makes a law legitimate, right? And what is the difference between legality and legitimacy? Then, I should have put this, then we go into, okay, well, if we're getting into legitimacy, what's moral legitimacy? So I talk about what morality means. And then what makes it, if it's moral, then what makes it legitimate in its content and construction? And so we went over all those properties. And then we say, okay, well, I talk about why law is organized in the West as it is, which is the purpose of our system is to force deliberate choices by the public. And that is so that we maintain hyper-adaptability, even though the public wants to get away from it. This is one of the things that's missing in our Constitution. This is why, St. Judge Scalia only could get it half right. I said, okay, well, if that's all those properties are true, what does a law like that look like? It includes some inputs, the propositions, the justifications, and all the other things that depended upon. But in specific, all propositions have to consist of obligations, rights, and alienations. Or what have we reserved? What do we desire? Therefore, we propose, and those propositions consist of these things. Well, okay, so that's great. Now do we say what is it? Where's the rights, alienations, and obligations? Okay. So then we have to go down to what are those rights? Where is it? Right. What are those rights consisting of obligations, rights, and inalienabilities? Right. So that's what they consist of. Well, then let's go back to constructing. Once we know what that's the case is, what do we have to do to create these moral legitimate and legal laws that are in this format here. And so we started working through the strategy, or the basic strategy. The underlying strategy of the law is that the first part was who's an insurer and what are they insuring? And so we went through that part. And then we had to say, okay, what are the rights obligations? So in order to produce that insurance, obviously I have to change the order here, I'm sorry. In order to produce that insurance, we have to have the force of arms, because it's the only possible way for all individuals to insure all other individuals equally. In other words, it's a non-fungible issue. Then we went through yesterday and we say, okay, well, that's great. Now that we've done insurance, what's the means of insurance? What's the means of self-determination by self-determined means? What does that mean? And what is the demand for self-determination? And what are the subjective differences in interdependence? In other words, how independent from or dependent upon others? And then what's the test of the utility of others? And therefore we end up with this long thing we did yesterday. So that's part one. We said, what are rights and how do we produce a law of rights, obligations, and alienations? What are rights, obligations, and alienations? If we know that's it is, how do we produce the first step, which is insurers? And then once we have produced insurers, what are they insuring? The right to self-determination. And now how do we test self-determination? And that's by sovereignty and reciprocity, right? So if I've given enough of an overview, did that make sense to you?
Perfect.
You just saying that.
Pretty much. It's good, man. It covered it all. It went from the beginning to the end of where we are now.
Okay. So I've hopefully given everybody the correct overview. In other words, this is a form to make sure we understand, everybody understands. From the fact that we have to acquire to survive, that we have to cooperate to acquire sufficiently, we have created a formal constructive logic. In other words, everything is dependent upon everything else to explain the construction of our law. It's important because people will tend to think that the common law is just made up. It's not. It's the result of resolution of disputes over time by the only people to preserve the common law, to invent and preserve the common law. In common law, I mean the common traditional law of the Anglo-Germanic, European, West Indo-European peoples. Within the group strategy of the West Indo-European, European, Germanic, Anglo-American system of law, just as we have developed our science over time, that same period of time, we've developed our law over time. Why did we develop science? Because there's no difference between science and law. Law is the production, as we understand it, is the production of testimony by which we can produce decidability independent of bias and deceit. Authority is really the answer. And the same thing with science. We took out of our courtroom and we applied it to the rest of the world. And that's how we came up with the sciences incrementally. So it's obvious why our science has progressed along with our law, because they're based on the same underlying principle. All I've done here is turn that into a science that you can now understand, constructed from first principles, if you're willing to follow my babbling about it for endless numbers of hours, which for some reason people are willing to. Although I don't know why what I'm doing is any different from any other course you've taught, other than we don't teach law as strict construction from first principles, and I teach it as strict construction from first principles. Thereby you can test whether legislation, regulation, and command are in fact law, or if they are merely some sort of deception, fraud, or error.
Okay.
So, are you ready to go on to sovereignty?
I am.
Okay, now, what does sovereignty mean? What does self-determination mean? Well, is there any difference between self-determination and sovereignty? Self-determination is a goal and sovereignty is a test. Right? So what does sovereignty mean? Hello, put your keys on the right fingers on keys. Supreme power or authority. We translate this in economics to exclusive control.
Okay.
Key to this is the word exclude, which is what makes the freaking Marxists nuts. Because that means you can't steal stuff.
Wait, it means the opposite of inclusive. That was a dig, kid.
No, I get it. But you know, there's those are all words of parasitism. It's like every word a leftist uses is a claim to a claim of right of parasitism. The authority of a state to govern another state. That's all it is. Okay, so this is important. The point I want to make here is that man is its own state, all political federations.
Change how to own state above. Thanks.
So unless it's the absence. That makes sense?
Yes.
All right. I'm going to put it over here instead because that's more obvious if I put it here. All human organizations are voluntary corporations. So who's the parent?
Sovereign. There you have it.
All right. Sovereignty is acquired through insurance. reciprocal. So exclusive control over what? Demonstrated interests. Now, didn't we cover demonstrated interests already?
Yes.
So if we go back to demonstrated interests, we're not making stuff up. The demonstrated interest is a fact. We've observed mankind demonstrates an interest in all these things, right? The law of demonstrated interest. People demonstrated interest means they defend those interests they have demonstrated. In other words, borne a cost of. So we defend our lives, our kin, our reputation, status, and etc., and our sustainable patterns of association, cooperation, etc. We obtain interests, which are, let's think of these as interpersonal, personal, interpersonal. We think of these as physical, right? Shareholder, title interests, artificial interests. And we have common interests, physical, institutional, human capital, and opportunity interests. Right? So we know what those demonstrated interests are. Boy, it's getting hard to roll through all this stuff.
Right. I took some Dramamine before we started so that I'd be fit.
You just said right?
Right.
Right. Have you seen the movie Alien?
I don't know.
Well, in the movie Alien, there's two guys who work, or like they're the mechanics. And one is called Parker, right? And the other guy's called Brett. And whatever Parker says, Brett goes, right.
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 There you go.
All right, so exclusive control over or exclusive control or monopoly. Right. Now, I can have a demonstrated interest, a monopoly of control over a fractional interest.
Right.
Right.
Sorry.
No, I was.
Now you made me sensitive.
No, well, the reason I do is I'm trying to stop myself from doing it too. But I need you to respond, otherwise
Okay.
I'll continue to stumble in the dark and having no comprehension of whether I'm
It's working.
communicating the idea or not. So I just needed to add that little bit of levity. What I'll try to do is find a little video of that
There you
Parker
go.
thing, and I'll put it on there.
Oh,
Right.
that reminds me. I forgot to mention that we appreciate all the comments below. Please comment. Please ask questions. Just demonstrate your interest.
Yep. Hello, who's home? Okay, so test of sovereignty, RV and positive. So this is a test of sovereignty, is a test of the exclusivity of control by the means of excluding others from control of one's demonstrated interests, where we have to go back to seeing demonstrated interests, right? And demonstrated interests are the empirical evidence of what people seek to acquire, maintain, consume, trade, and convert, right? I mean, convert means they transform from one state to another. All right. So exclusivity or monopoly of control means you're excluding others from it. So sovereignty means you are sovereign in your life, your behavior, your relationships, whatever. And what that means is, of course, is that people won't impose costs upon you by violating that sovereignty of demonstrated interests, right? Your exclusivity of control obtained by exchange of reciprocal insurance with others. and your ability to call upon others to ensure and perform restitution for any violation of that's your sovereignty. One thing that's not visible here, I've tried to cover in outlaws. Now, if you're not sovereign, you're not reciprocally insured. Under this, it means it's open season. All right. So this whole universalist thing is a conflation of two different properties. One is the in-group agreement for reciprocal insurance of sovereigns. One is the mystical, imperial, or globalist, or deist view that this same applies to everyone.
Right.
Now, we have to test reciprocity. This is where we're going to have fun. Now, how do we know whether your, excuse me, and so it means you have exclusive control, but how do we test violations? So the problem is, how do we test for a violation? So we're going to, it's by test of reciprocity. So we're going to have to go back up and say, okay, should I do it here? No, I should do it here, right? I can refer it. See law of reciprocity,
That's right.
just like I did in the last one.
Correct.
Let's just do our due diligence here. Oh shit, did I forget to do this? Yeah, I didn't think they were going to cover that. We didn't cover the legal meaning. I want to test define. It's so funny if the Proprietarian Institute came up here.
What's that?
I would just be funny if the institutes came up in the search somewhere. The practice of exchanging things with other for mutual benefit. Let's try to find a better one. Let's see if we can find it. There we go.
There you go.
Let me just do the reciprocal. Back to its original case once more, undoing backward. These really don't get it. What they need, this definition is pretty good, so we'll go with it. When the contribution of each party meets the expectations of the other party, or that's a via positiva.
Yep. Ah, I like that.
But the via negativa right?
Right. Now you did those differently. I want you to make the form of via positiva and via negativa. Thank you. So there's an implicit retribution, failure to generate cause for
Thank you.
retribution.
So I always like to illustrate the difference between I use this particular example because it's funny. Viking ethics versus the ethics of the bazaar.
Okay.
So both Vikings and people in the Middle East traveling from bazaar to bazaar are temporary traders. So the Middle East thing is to haggle, right? It's a haggling thing. For some reason, that's like due diligence. I mean, that's how they see it, is due diligence. And but what it really means is every single transaction is open to change. In other words, there's never a contract.
Right.
There's only opportunity. And so every stage of the contract is open to continuous negotiation, the maximization of every opportunity in the chain. Well, it makes everybody poorer, right? Right, because you can't bring any efficiency to the price market.
Right. It's very high transaction cost.
Correct. But everybody feels powerful in it, right? Everybody feels like they have maximized their suppression of mistrust. So think of the mind that what kind of mind that's working. They also think they're maximizing the opportunity by taking advantage of the ignorant. So like when you're traveling in the third world, they'll always try some ridiculous price, for some t-shirt or something. And they'll usually, well, it's just can I get away with this? Now let's talk about Viking ethics. Also a migratory people, or not migratory, transitory traders. Their attitude is that it starts out quite differently. I can kill you and take your stuff, but I would rather trade with you because that way I make money every time. That way I can go steal somebody else's shit and sell it to you, and you can sell me some shit and we can keep this going on. But if it isn't going to be a fair trade, I'd just as soon kill you and take your stuff. This is a kind of due diligence as well, right? This creates the. Do you understand? What are you going to say?
No, it's yeah. You don't want to cause that one to have an incentive to retaliate.
So you end up with a very different ethic from the bazaar, Because of the bizarre guy, he's thinking, well, I mean, if I try to screw them, they'll just kill me and take it anyway, right? Which is why people ran out. Good people went to them and bad people ran away. Then you have the ethics of the village. Whereas you better not price your carrots cheaper than mine because you're taking money out of my mouth. The only way we can compete is I grow better, you grow better carrots than me, or I grow better carrots than you. But if you fucker with me on price, then you're taking money out of my mouth. Then the fourth quadrant is the high trust society, which is establish a price. The price of what you're offering, right? And it's basically cost plus. It's the profit I need to make on this. Right? And we compete on price as well as quality and choice. So what does reciprocity consist of in each of those cases?
Right.
Now, the answer is that we're always there's so the question is there's always the reciprocal exchange happening, right? There's always some trade going on as long as it's voluntary. It's the externalities that trade that people are trying to impose costs via, whether by deception or coercion or not, or renegotiation or not holding to promises or something, right? So reciprocity is like morality. We know what is reciprocal because I'm going to define it here in a moment. We've defined it up above in reciprocity, but the conditions of reciprocity might vary, and the scope of reciprocity might vary. So Western civilization, we're always defending the commons. So you don't get to haggle. You don't get to play price games. You put something on offer, that's the price. You make a deal, that's the price. I start trading with you on this contract, we do a contract, that's the deal, right? Things don't change once they're agreed to.
Right.
There's no externality permitted over time, even over time. Now I might go to you and say, well, Brad, we agreed to this, but I got to call you in advance. My price has gone up by 20%. Now, I don't know if you'll just split that with me, 10% both directions, or if your side can absorb the price increase. But I can't, after this deal, I can't do another one because I'll go under. And what really happens in real life is like, fuck yeah, I'll take it. That's all right. We'll make it up on the next one, because it's the repeat business that matters from homogenous or integrated people that develops a low transaction cost pattern of specialization and trade versus a high transaction cost, right? Low expectation of continuous revenue,
right,
arrangement. So what I'm trying to get across is that reciprocity may be true, but what that reciprocity possible is limited by the formal and informal the incentives, informal and formal institutions that suppress suppress any attempt to privatize the good of the commons. In other words, producing high trust, low friction trade is a commons. Any attempt to screw with that is a violation of the commons. So that, in other words, we're doing at scale what the village carrot sellers are doing at small scale, right? So however you're regulating externalities, the Vikings are doing it by violence. The Middle Eastern bazaars aren't doing it at all. The village is doing it by price controls, price limitations, and the high trust is doing it by contract, consistency and coherence of contract. Mm-hmm. We could take what's her name's book on the commons there. I had it, I had it right there on the tip of my tongue. Female economist, not coming to me. We could, it'll come to me. We could take her book and we could spend like forever talking about this subject of the comment, how different cultures handle the commons, because that's really what she did, right? Her work is in how different cultures handle the commons. And we could learn a great deal about it and mankind. But my point is simply that just as morality is absolute, because reciprocity is absolute, does not mean what's the conditions for reciprocity do not vary. The same thing has to do with property. While property increasingly is atomized, just as externalities have been minimized, in other words, we've increasingly used incremental suppression to eliminate the profiting by externalities. The same thing has happened in the atomization of property from the tribe or clan to the family to the individual. And that property disposition is at the individual level because that's what's useful. But it's the same thing. By making property individual, we've suppressed rent seeking or parasitism upon the individual's demonstrated interests, right? But if the village builds my house, is it my house? Or is it a property of the village? Well, I mean, traditionally it's the village's house, right? Nobody's going to evict you from it, but I mean, it doesn't mean you have rights of abusus, rather, or
right.
to do anything to it. So that's the point I want to make here, because I don't want to see the relativists come in and say that morality and reciprocity and sovereignty are somehow fungible. They're not. However, the degree of suppression of irreciprocity, right?
Yeah, it kind of comes down to the expectations of all the parties. And if the expectations are low trust, they get a low trust outcome. And if they're high trust, they get a high trust outcome. And those are not the same, and they are objectively different.
Correct. So therefore, disputes between parties are resolvable despite their differences in opinion. So if I come to you, I'm in the Middle East, and I come to you in Germany, and I try to play this fucking game with you, and we get in a dispute, the higher trust court will prevail. It's decidable. They may not like it, but it's decidable. So this is the problem when you're engaging with differences. It's decidable that higher trust always prevails, right? It's just, have you done due diligence if you've got to that point?
Right.
So what's happening, of course, is that what works in the Middle East low trust bazaar ethic is a crime in a high trust polity. And what a high trust polity demands of a low trust polity is an irrational expectation. I saw you run with that. See, I don't know if the audience is going to run with that quite as fast as you did. So maybe you want to help the audience understand that.
Right. Repeat the premise, please, and then I will be able to properly respond.
So if you come from a low trust polity with low trust expectations to a high trust polity, now if you play your game that you would play in the low trust polity, that's of course a crime in the high trust polity. But if you're from a high trust polity and go to do a deal in a low trust polity,
you're a fool.
You failed your due diligence.
You're being taken advantage of like nobody's business, because that t-shirt's $25,000. Like, oh, okay.
So this is the fundamental problem. And so it's not that reciprocity and morality are relative, right? However, the enforcement is relative.
That's right.
Right? Because people only insure at their institutional capacity.
Right.
So lower trust, less developed people are poorer because they are lower trust. In other words, they are dramatically increasing transaction costs. And the West, we're poorer because we fucking eliminated transaction costs. Matter of fact, the only transaction costs left are the ones that the Bitcoiners trying to get rid of, which is rent seeking by the financial sector. Fundamentally, there's no reason for transaction costs anymore, other than like the whatever it costs to process the electrons, which is
right.
Nothing. So thank you for pointing that out for the audience. Saw your face light up, and I'm like, he's going to play with this one. I thought you'd be even harsher than that, but
I had to reconstitute it because it's like that. It's just that would just struck me, and I'm like, okay, let's make sure I get it right.
Okay. All right. So, what is the law of reciprocity independent of context? Right. You stated it obviously, where the expectations of others. But what expectations are possible? What expectations it's always get problem to demonstrated interests and what people think of as interests. Well, I have an interest in something, like getting away with something. That's not a demonstrated interest. Getting away with something isn't it's a violation of someone else's demonstrated interest. All right. So we have to figure out what is it that what is the test of reciprocity. We're going to go up here and we're going to go through that again. Preservation of cooperation and the avoidance of retaliation are the requirements for productive, not unproductive, exhaustively informed, warranted, voluntary transfer of demonstrated interests, free of imposition of costs dependent upon the demonstrated interests of others, within the limits of liability and restitution.
Right.
This is often better stated as the inverse. In other words, this is the via positiva, the negativa. It's a productive, not unproductive transfer. Now, I might, as I've humiliated Walter Block a little bit, if you and I engage in a blackmail transaction, it may be voluntary, but it's not productive. I don't have more at the end, right?
Right.
If you've blackmailed me. What is exhaustively informed? Well, it means not selectively informed. In other words, I haven't, it's the lemon law problem or the horse trader problem. I may not be able to know everything wrong with this horse, right? But if I could have known, then I'm liable. I may not know everything wrong with this car, but if I could have known, then I would be liable for it. When you say it's warranted, you're not evading a warranty, meaning if I selectively informed you or I did something unproductive, you can't evade the warranty. Now, this is the difference between Semitic ethics and Western ethics. Is in Western ethics, you warranty every trade. In Semitic ethics, there's no warranty on a trade. It's a deal only takes two people, and if you did the deal, that's the end of it.
It's kids in the parlance of children, it's blackjack, no take back.
The transfer was voluntary. I don't think that needs too much explanation, but it wasn't an involuntary transfer. This is kind of an interesting one. So, I mean, how do you know whether something's voluntary or not? There's only one test, right? It was free of coercion. Well,
Right.
I mean, so we already know what demonstrated interests are. We've gone through them, all right. But what we mean is that, yeah, you can't cause a voluntary transfer of undemonstrated interests. In other words, if I steal homie's bicycle and sell it to you for $10, right, we've both committed a crime. You have the upper responsibility of due diligence to make sure that I haven't stolen homie's bicycle to you to get ice cream money.
Right.
Right. And secondly, it's kind of, this is the more interesting one. And it's if I voluntarily transfer to you a benefit, that's not by externality, that's not a harm. In other words, if your neighbor and I do a trade that makes his property and my property improved, and the value of your property improves, you have no complaint, right? You might, but I didn't want my property to go up in value. That's not a, you may be trying to get away with something like lower taxes, but which is actually the case, right?
Right.
You can improve a territory such that it costs your neighbor an increase in tax because you brought up his value, right? That's not a criticism. Of demonstrated interest free of others and within the limits of liability and restitution. So this is the example of this is, can you reverse it? In other words, this limits you to those acts which are reversible. So this hence the example of suicide, of assisted suicide.
Oh my.
It's a voluntary exchange, but it's not reversible.
That's what I have patients ask me with some frequency, like, just shoot me. I said, you can't pay me enough. That's all.
Well, first of all, post hoc, it's not testable, right? And secondly, it's not restitutable.
That's right.
So you can't do it. It's most of the time, it's the correct statement of the doctor's obligation. I shall take no action that is not restitutable.
First, do no harm.
What?
They say first do no harm.
Yeah, but exactly, right? And especially if that harm, because harm to the patient isn't restitutable. Or you can't, it doesn't, you can put money onto it, but I mean, you can't fix certain things.
That's right. That's right.
Like the massive amount of scarring in my neck from my cancer surgery. And the fact that I have no feeling over here. What the fuck? It's not rest. But it was a predictable exchange. Right? I mean, it was like, well, I can only do this, but that's what's going to happen. At least I stayed with my face. They told me I could lose my.
Yeah, yeah. Your boyish good looks.
I don't feel very boyish anymore, boss.
You're
I
charmed.
feel like an old fart.
All right.
All right, now that's a reciprocity. But reciprocity means reciprocity in display, word, and deed. Now I'm going to reverse that this time and say reciprocity in deed, word, and display. Right?
Right.
Out.
Too many ends.
Thank you.
The cursor was in the right place. I had to say it. You're doing great.
Too many ends. All right, I've been accused of that before. That's a really interesting face you've got on there. All right.
Thank you.
Now, the problem is that truth is a deed display in Word. It's probably that's right the answer. Let's do Word first. So the problem is, what does truth mean? And this is where we go off on our wild
This is
goose
going to be
chase.
the deep dive.
I hope I'm ready for this. What do I have?
Okay. Stretch out.
All right, so I'm going to just do it from here. Got to get into
This is
decidability.
the truth series.
Right. So we have to answer what decidability is.
Right. That's what our goal is, correct?
Right. But we have to do decidability. How do we decide? How do we decide? Well, what does decidable mean? Watch, it'll take me 5 minutes to find this.
I hope you're wrong.
I don't think so.
That's pretty cool.
Not in this one. I'll just write it out for you so we don't have to deal with it.
Right.
Okay, so I know we covered this in the other videos, but we're going to say, what does decidable means? Oh, fuck, I'm gonna have to just go find it real quick, if that's all right with you. This isn't right. I say this really elegantly somewhere. That's it.
It cannot be wrong.
Well,
Certainty, infallibility.
no, it isn't certainty. You can't be certain. We can only know. This is the problem of the false truth candidate,
Yes.
undecidable hierarchy, is that we've made all this stuff about truth being this ultimate, and we never can know it, right? I mean, we can rarely know it with certainty, except sufficient for the question. In other words, it's either sufficient, but it doesn't need to be
That's
certain.
an interesting function. So infallibility is a via negativa.
Correct. It's satisfaction of demand for infallibility for the question. So the question is decidable,
That's
which
great.
means, this makes sense?
Yes.
That's why I wanted to go look
Just
for it.
takes a second though. That one's, it's because it's got some curiosities within it.
Yes.
And I want to elucidate on that for the audience, okay?
Okay.
That will make me feel better about being here. Just a little bit. Satisfaction means it's sufficient to satisfy the demand for infallibility, which is it's not false. The statement is not false.
Right.
And it's proof that makes the audience sit back and not expect more.
It meets the expectations of the audience, right? We just went through meeting expectations. It meets the expectations of those who would retaliate against you if you failed your due diligence.
That's good. Now that is like a preference to expectations, is it not? I'm sorry.
Okay, so this is the criteria. So satisfies, what does I say? Satisfies. Forgot it already.
Yeah.
Now notice how this is a
There's a via positiva and a via negativa in there, man.
yeah. Okay, let me just see if I can get this out first.
Yep.
The problem is, where did I cover it here? Did I cover it true? I cover it here. Truthful. Yeah, I covered it right there.
Ooh.
Okay. This is when I tell people the fundamental insight I had was this one, was truth.
Where's that?
Once you understand decidability and truth, as I'm framing it here, everybody understood reciprocity, not as thoroughly as I put it. But once you have truth, this is the secret sauce, right? To the entire insight. It's what I said. Truth was the hard problem, right? It was the first hard. This was the hard problem that we couldn't solve. People couldn't solve because they're trying to work with via positivas.
Right.
So truth is the testimony that satisfies demand for infallibility in the question at hand.
Which is just a fascinating construction.
Isn't it awesome? It
It
makes
is.
things
It's the
so much
infallibility.
easier.
The infallibility thing is what's really the kicker, because it's a via negativa statement. Get rid of the L in testimony. Sorry.
Well, this is really at hand.
That's interesting. Yes, that's good. There's so satisfaction of the demand of interested parties.
Was affected by?
Well, no, go testimony that provides satisfaction of demand by interested parties for infallibility.
Yeah, I think that's probably, I don't want to,
Okay.
I want to maintain this phrase.
Okay.
So that's what truth means. And so this gets you, this turns it into, this gets us away from utopian, Platonic ideal versions of truth. Now, it only means testimony. A testimony is performative. All testimony consists of, I promise that, right? That's a performative truth. Notice how hard it is. If you start saying that every truth, you put, I promise that, I promise that.
Right.
And I promise and warranty is a performance, right? Is a form of truth. Now, this is really a beautiful thing, is that it takes it from ideal to real. Now start making claims where
So
you say
empirical as opposed to ideal.
yeah, empirical is observable and performative is possible.
Okay.
So when I say, if I had to go through and say, I promise and warranty that before every claim I made, you would get very quick visibility into how few claims people make that are in such. What they mostly are is like their moral arguments. The billboard on my head that says these are the moral terms, their truth claims are not truth claims at all. They're advertisements for agreement. And so if you want to reduce consciousness to its function.
Uh-oh. I'm getting my pen out. Go.
It's a little dot sign on your head that rolls by all the terms of cooperation, and your opinion doesn't mean anything. It's just like, I want. You know, everything out of your mouth is just, I want.
Right. I expect this to get that. Yeah.
That's all it is. It's so freaking humiliating. You know, every time I think of it, I go back to writing software for robots, right? AIs, right? And at the time I was doing this, it's just tanks, right? I mean, it's essentially a light tank. And I'm trying to make the tank have behavior, because behavior is quite random versus, right? And of course, the information density you need to produce randomness is beyond the capacity of machines, so it doesn't make any. You just have to
That's right.
resort to it.
Right.
So, but I mean, once you realize that all the things doing are running around is because I want.
Oh no.
You realize that that's all people are doing. You're like, I want.
That must have been quite disturbing to discover that.
What's that?
Must have been quite disturbing to make that jump, which is to say that people are behaving just like my robot.
Yeah, and my dumb fucking robot.
It's like, wow.
And you realize when you're doing this is the same, like I said, Nassim Taleb did it with financials, and I did it with AIs, but we both came to the same conclusion that only outliers matter, and it's really hard to discover an outlier because whatever information is available produces deterministic runs. So what happens is no matter what bot you produce, everything it does is deterministic, right? I mean, so it's really, unless you can come up with some particularly advanced strategy and you can give the bot a really long memory, which you couldn't back in the day, you can today, right? It won't be able to create scenarios under which it can meld. In other words, you need a lot of scenarios in memory to be able to come up with a recombination that produces a novel reaction or outcome. And so once I realized that, I'm like, it was so. I tell people I was depressed for like 6 months.
Oh my!
It's like I could never look at people the same again. I want. And that's all that's going on. There's nothing else going on. It's just coloring. It's just peacock feathers to color. I want. That's it. Wear an earring.
Oh my!
Put a hat on. It's verbal decoration for I want. Some people are better at verbal peacock feathers.
Oh my!
That's all it is.
It must make social interaction very difficult for you, Kurt.
Well, I mean, the way I handled it is the way autistics handle integrating into normies, is you just don't pay attention.
You just ignore it.
You just realize that it's all, what you want is the company.
Yep.
Right. You want the company, you want to feel it. And you basically turn like 99.995% of your brain off. And then you act like everybody else, and then you develop like 50 topics of idle chit chat conversation. Right. And then you just play them like cards. Right. I mean,
it's just a bobblehead doll sitting in the back of my car.
Horrible.
So
but, and people wonder why I'm like, anyway, but really when you produce an AI, that's the problem, is that you realize that that's all. Once you create an AI that's behavioral, now this is a difference.
Yep.
If you try to make these task-based things, you never get there. But if you try to give a bot, like my bots had 16 personality traits, right? And that's how I regulated it, was scale of personality traits. And then I had before, during, and after conditions over some period of time. And so I'd only remembered those things that were meaningful.
Right.
Basically, those things which got it fed, which was energy replenishment or ammo replenishment, or had to fight. And it would just scale those things. And then whatever context you were in, it would just rate them and look at the different criteria and you could make a pretty effective behavioral bot that way. But once you realize what's going on, you're just all you're doing is assigning property values, which is caloric value, to different things. And that's it. I mean, in urgency and less urgency, threat, response, your response. And it was just,
I wanted to say this, since it's the outliers make the difference that makes a difference. And then I'm like, I point to the black swans at the top of the screen. That explains everything to me.
Yep. So we having fun with truth so far?
So far.
All right.
Wait, fix that those. Meets the expectations of those. Criteria. Thank you.
Just for the audience, I use Grammarly, but the size of this document would mean that it would be like a 30-second delay between key presses.
Hang time, right?
Otherwise, I'm a big fan of Grammarly. Okay, so now the problem is, whoops. I love my little hotkeys. Okay, so let's go back over to truth. So we're on the third one here. I think we're under. All right. I'm going to go backwards. All right. Well, what does honesty mean? It's that testimony you give with full knowledge that your knowledge is incomplete. Your language or vocabulary may be insufficient. You haven't performed any due diligence in the elimination of error and bias, but bias, but your warranting is free of deceit. So honesty doesn't mean you've done due diligence against ignorance, error, and bias. It only means you've done due diligence against deceit, if you're being honest. But it's within the scope of the precision limited to the question you wish to answer. In other words, one of the things that people trick you do is they get you to testify to something specific and then claim it's the same as general. Well, this is, of course, a fraud. I hate this stuff when it happens in courtrooms. It makes me furious. And what you really want to know is, and then within the scope of precision limited to the question you want to answer, and the promise that another person possessed of the same knowledge, performing the same due diligence against deceit, having the same experience, would provide approximately the same testimony.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, our test of honesty is a test of agreement to testimony. And we do this by test of incentives. This is why people can work on juries. That's why we can interview people and tell if they're lying. Because once we have sufficient knowledge of circumstance and incentives, we can determine whether that person is engaged in lying or deceit, or they're just engaged in ignorance, error, and bias. Right? And a lot of the time, people are simply ignorant, or they will basically overestimate their abilities, which is what the purpose of the 20th century was, to get incompetent people to overestimate their abilities. The next is a test
Kruger
of
Dunn, right? Kruger, Dunning.
Dunning-Kruger.
God, doggone it! I keep doing that. I knew you would correct me though, and I appreciate that. Sorry.
Martin and I have a dispute over Dunning-Kruger, and I think it's because whenever Martin and I dispute something, it's because we are answering two different questions.
All right.
So what's the test of reasonableness? This is important. Did you make a reasonable decision? That testimony you give as a justification for your reporting of your belief, justification, preference, choice, or actions, with full knowledge that your knowledge is incomplete, your language is insufficient, and you've not performed due diligence, the elimination of error and bias, but what you warranty is free of deceit, with the scope of precision limited to the question. In other words, when you're honest, you're just saying what you understood, right? When you're being reasonable, you're trying to justify that within that honesty, that your testimony is reasonable.
So it's a higher order of truth telling
right?
Okay.
You're explaining why it's reasonable. See, in honesty, you say it, you say what you say, but you don't defend it, right? You
Right.
leave it up to the party. When you say something is reasonable, that you're saying that, and it's reasonable that I came to that conclusion.
Right.
You're still not saying that I'm free of ignorance, error, and bias. It's just that I'm being honest, and I think I was being reasonable.
Right.
Now we get to meaningful. That testimony you would give if your knowledge, your information is incomplete, your language is insufficient, but you have performed due diligence in the elimination of error, imaginary content, wishful thinking, bias, fictionalism, and deceit, right, within the scope of the question. So this is where you're becoming an adult. So a child can be honest, a young adult can be reasonable, an adult can be responsible, because you can perform due diligence against your own presumptions, right? Does this make sense?
Yes.
Honesty, reasonableness, truthfulness. Then there's ideal truth. This is important. You can't do better than this.
Okay.
Right?
I can't do better than truthfulness.
Right. You can't. You could submit your testimony to the market and have others falsify it. But there's a limit to what you can claim is truthful, right? Which is limited to you. So your whole thing here is that, have I done due diligence against error, imaginary content, wishful thinking, bias, fictionalism, deceit? The problem is a lot of people are reasonable and they're honest, but very few people are truthful because they aren't actually doing this. They aren't doing due diligence, especially against fictionalisms, which is theology, ideology, philosophy, etc. Even history. Now, shit. I'm missing one.
Which one is that?
I wanted to disambiguate this, right? Because this is a spectrum, right? This truthfulness. I can testify to my hypothesis, my theory, and my survival. In other words, if I've done due diligence and the market has done due diligence,
Right.
if I've done diligence and I've run tests, if I've done diligence and I've been rational. Now, what we've got here is the rational. What we want to add is, I think I probably should do it right now. So you don't get the magic edit button, I do. I'm special.
You are. I'm willing to testify to that fact, brother. Very special indeed.
All right, so there are 3 stages of truthfulness. The hypothesis. Well, I've done it with my reasoning. As far as I know, I've done it. I've gone out and done an empirical testing. And it's survived empirical market by others.
Yeah,
So,
survival.
right. So there's 3 levels of truthfulness. And I didn't break them out because I didn't want to conflate that these are all matters of individual responsibility. Now we get into what the problem is.
Okay.
Is that testimony you would give if your knowledge was complete, your language is sufficient, stated without error, cleansed of bias, absent of deceit, within scope of precision, limited to the question you wish to answer, and the promise that another, blah, blah, blah. So what this means is ideal truth is perfect parsimony. It would be the completely disambiguated description constructed from exclusively Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Right. So the problem is, can we ever know this? Well, there are things.
Okay.
There are rules we can know, right? But can we? It's the problem is anything that is sufficient for this.
Yeah.
Shouldn't be open to it's very hard to discuss, right? This is reciprocity. We're describing the criteria for truth. My argument would be any improvement in this will be an increase in precision. It won't be a falsification. So this is what we're saying with ideal truths, is that any variation from testimony would only be an increase in precision. It wouldn't be falsification.
Right.
So what people do is they confuse these things. This is a performative truth.
Optimally performative truth, right?
Yeah. Right. This is an ideal truth. This is it. It's a hypothesis, right? You might be able to get there, but we only know that in reductio circumstances. So we tend only to know reductio. In other words, general rules of arbitrary precision. In other words, when people use these really sophomoric tests in philosophy to say something is true or not, they act like you can infinitely chain these things together. Well, you can't, of course. I mean, they start breaking down really, really quickly. So as we say, logic is falsificationary, not justificationary. This is the primary problem in philosophical history, is they're trying to use the wrong method to prove something. What you can do is you can prove something's constructible. What you're doing is proving that by proof of construction, you're saying, well, this is at least possible.
Right.
It doesn't mean it's true completely. In other words, there still might be increase in, it doesn't mean it's ideally true. There could be an increase in precision. Now, what's analytic truth? The testimony you would give promising the internal consistency of one or more statements used in the construction of a proof in an axiomatic declarative system. In other words, truthfulness is a real, ideals an ideal, and an analytic truth is arbitrary. In other words, we can declare axioms, we can only discover laws. You can't declare a law, you can only discover it. You can declare an axiom, you may discover a law and treat it as an axiom, but an axiom is a declaration, it's a construction. So whenever you're talking about analytic truth, unless it's very reductio, you're always talking about, I have written a proof of possibility. And therefore, when I say something is true in analytic truth, in other words, logic, I'm saying that I testify to the internal consistency of this claim. I don't necessarily, and maybe not be able to, testify to the external correspondence,
Right.
complete, etc. of this claim. And then, of course, we have the tautological truth, which is 1 = 1, 2 = these are just
Yeah.
two statements using different terms. So all we really care about is really that these are nonsense. We might care about right?
That's funny because it's not, that word is good because they're not sensible.
Right. Well, I mean,
They
in the sense that I write a geometric proof, I mean, it's a proof of internal consistency, whatever, right?
Yeah, but
I mean,
it doesn't exist in the real world.
right. It's verbal. Because we tend to think that there's this, we forget that all the grammars are just languages. I mean, just all the grammars is just differences in vocabulary and principles. So a tautological truth is just like, well, what does that mean? It's a circular definition. Analytic truth is a promise that it's internally consistent. That's just a constructive method. And ideal truth is one that we could say, well, if we had this is what we would goal for. In other words, the goal would be to produce a science of ideal truths. And that's what we would want to get to, which is that there's no difference between.
That's right. 100% correspondence.
Right, between these two. Oh, that's the objective of science, is to incrementally approach whatever ideal truth is out there. The difference is we can never have that knowledge. It's complete.
We can't know that it's complete.
Right. Well, and then there's always room for improvement. It's like I always like, the canonical example is Aristotle, Newton, and Einstein, all of them are fucking wrong.
Well, I would say this, it's within the margins of error.
Correct.
That's all it is. It's
at the level of precision.
Yep.
Correct. At the level of precision they were making the claims, for the purposes intended, they did incrementally better. But that's what science does. Testimony does. We eliminate ignorance, error, bias, deceit, wishful thinking, sloating, framing, fictionalisms, denials, and all this other crap we do because we're going what instead of testimony. All right, so that's what the spectrum of truth is. Testimony that satisfies the demand for infallibility. Well, you're on it. If you want honesty from a child, reasonableness from a young adult, you want truthfulness from a pure adult, you want scientists to produce ideal truth, approach ideal truths, you want logicians to pursue analytic truth, and tautological truth is just an effort that somebody doesn't know what the fuck they're talking about. I had to close with something funny.
That was beautiful. Right. That was like a wonderful.
All right. Okay. So where truthful speech satisfies increasing infallibility of demand for decidability. Increasing demand for infallibility. So.
Because it's necessary, because who is less fallacious in this circumstance?
Right, it's a market competition between degrees of infallibility. Right, that's what we're trying to produce. Let me put that down here. How did I just say it?
We are trying to produce.
Right.
In display word deed.
I'm going to move that here.
Oh, I like that. I would ask you to, is that
What?
in the public commons, in the commons, or is that necessary, or is that overly specific, or?
I don't think once you can do, I think this, I'm just trying to figure if I can get down to. No, I've got the next section. I've got
Okay,
it in the next section. So demand for decidability, in other words, truth is sufficient, right? Truthful speech, which is what you speak, sufficient for demand for decidability. Oh, it's already there. Increasing infallibility of decidability, where demand for decidability consists in the reverse. A question statement is decidable if an algorithm, a set of operation exists within the limits of the system. I'm not going to read through this, is too nerdy. That can produce a decision of choice, a decision. In other words, if information sufficient for the decision is present, it's decidable, right? In the obverse, instead, we should determine if there's a means of choosing without the need for additional information supply. Yeah, this is too nerdy. I don't want to go down that deep.
this totally, okay, I get this sense here that
What?
you're just writing code for all the bots out here.
Well, I mean, I just don't want to go down.
No, it's good.
I want to stay on the issue because we just talked about this right here and the
Yep.
scope. And so I want to get down to this. I don't want to
Okay, good.
go off on a.
I'm stopping.
So the problem we say it is sufficient for increasing infallibility of decidability for the context. Now, what determines the context? Well, I mean, for me, it's intelligible enough. For me, it's intelligible enough to imagine that there's a relationship. In other words, I just might be thinking this through, right?
Right.
And I'm like, well, okay, well, there's probably some relationship there. I mean, why? Because it's a meaningless cost. It's reasonable. It's decidable enough to feel confident that my decision will satisfy my needs and not be a waste of time and energy. Again, this is an increase in costs. It's actionable. It's decidable enough for me to take actions given time, effort, knowledge, and resources. That's for me, right?
Yep.
Now, whether it's ethical and moral, it's decidable in me for not to impose risks or costs upon the interests of others, or to cause others to retaliate against me if they have knowledge or transparency into my actions. It's normative, meaning it's decidable enough to resolve a conflict without subjective opinion among my fellows with similar values. In other words, if I fail, I followed norms.
Right.
So we don't punish people for following norms when they err.
Yep.
Right. When that goes, right. It's judicial. It's decidable enough to resolve a conflict without subjective opinion across different peoples with different knowledge, comprehension, values. In other words, it may have been a normative choice, but is it a judicial choice? In other words, is there still going to be retaliation against me regardless of whether I held normative values? This is an example between where you get into torts, right? My values might be different from yours. My beliefs might be, this is a judicially decidable. Then there's scientifically decidable, regardless of opinions or perspectives. logically decidable out of physical or logical necessity, and tautological rather than, okay, this is it. I gotta figure out how to say this. All right. And so this is a series of market demand for increasing infallible decidability. Okay. So I only have to worry about the costs to me, the increasing cost to others, or the externalities of my behaviors, right? So if I publish scientifically, this is
Okay.
not good public.
You ready for this? You got before, during, and after. You also have a OODA loop in there.
Where?
Intelligible is observational. Orient, yeah. Decided, you haven't acted yet. That tells you if it's decidable is your decision-making process.
What does the D stand for?
Decide. And then the action comes during. And after is the next before.
All right, so I don't want to go back to the nerdy stuff. So, I really don't. What I was trying to get across here is that testimony that satisfies the demand for infallibility of the context in question. Well, I mean, we want to know what testimony means. It's truthfulness, right? Right? Or it's reasonableness, or it's just honesty.
Right.
This is determined by the degree of due diligence. Right?
Right. Yeah.
Right. So, but so what's the, what get this the spectrum demand for infallibility?
Yeah.
Ooh. So if it's me, I've decided I can make these things, but what happens if it has externalities? And what happens if it has externalities of property? What happens if it international informational externalities? So now we get into, are we doing okay? Can I keep going, or is it time to stop?
I'm wiped out, man. I think it's time to wrap. We've been going for a good bit here. Is that fair?
Yeah, we're for 2 hours. Yeah, we should stop. I felt like it was like just a short time, but it was really quite long. All right. So what we've done today is we've covered, we said we would cover where is it? We were working our way through rights, obligations, and then we get to the what's insurance, and what the rights and obligations for insurance are. What's self-determination? We went through self-determination. And then we went to what is the test of sovereignty, and went through sovereignty, which was relatively easy. And then we went on to the test of reciprocity. We said, see the law of reciprocity. So we went back up to we went up to reciprocity, and we discussed that briefly because that was relatively easy because we covered so much of it. Then we said, well, what's decidable and what's true? We moved over to discussing of reciprocity. And we said the first thing we have to do is decidability. And so we discussed what decidability was. And then we went on to truth, the spectrum of different kinds of truth, and the spectrum of demands for infallibility, meaning by who and when. Tomorrow, or was it tomorrow? If it's tomorrow we meet, or whatever day we meet,
Yes.
we're going to go through what it's possible to speak about.
Wow. It's like, let's not leave any stones unturned, okay?
Dude, I mean, when we say we're going to build it from strictly constructive from first principles, there's no stone unturned.
That's it.
All right.
Wonderful.
I think I've worn you out. I've worn
No.
myself out.
It's good, man. I'll look forward
Well-
to recharge and do it again tomorrow.
All right, boss, send me the links.
Adios.